This was my flaming plea for free trade. Now I'm going to juxtapose it with a couple of cases that can be made against free trade. The first can be made from a state-centered approach. And if you remember the state-centered approaches that I described 4 weeks ago in session number 1, then they are not about as many people getting as wealthy as possible. No, they are about states trying to maintain or increase their relative position of powers as compared to other states and as compared to other actors. So it's all about the power being in the hand of the state in question and not about making everyone get rich as possible. So from this perspective, what I said before looks a little bit different. So if free traders say that trade is a positive sum game and it's not everything that one player loses, the other wins, and the other way around, then as a state-centered theorist, you might say, well, that may very well be if you look at it economically. However, if we think politically as states, we have to look at the relative gains all sides make rather than at the absolute gains. And then we have to be very, very careful about how our actions will help the other states. So for example, if you think about the development of China, which was certainly only made possible by the free trade regime that we have. So without this free trade regime, China could not have increased its GDP manyfold over the last couple of decades. And this made everyone richer. It made a lot of people in Chinese richer. It also made a lot of people around the world richer because they can now consume less expensive Chinese products. So that's, from an economic perspective, a total success story. From a political perspective, if you look at it from the perspective of the American government, as state-centered theorists imagine this government, it's a whole different story, because there you might think, well, 30 years ago we were many times more powerful than the Chinese government, and now they are getting ever stronger and ever stronger, and at some point they might be as powerful as we are, or maybe even more powerful. So this whole free trade idea, which made a lot of people in our country richer and maybe even ourselves as individuals richer, however, it was not a good idea, because now we have nurtured this powerful adversary, and that's something that we should not have done. And if you play board games from time to time, you might also be able to be emphatic about this, because then you can always trade with other players. But if you see that it's getting towards the end of the game and the other player might be winning the game, then you might be very reluctant to trade with them, because it might help you and it might help them. However, you try not to help them at all. And if you come from this kind of theoretical perspective, then you pretty much look at the world as a board game and as states as competing players. So even if both sides win, it might be bad for you. And then we have the argument that free trade is best for everyone's total welfare. And again, as a state-centered theorist, you don't necessarily refute this claim. You say this may very well be. However, politically thinking, we must be very, very careful not to have to rely on other countries when it comes to strategically important resources. So all those strategic resources that you might need if there's international conflict, these are resources that you want to have in your own country, or have produced in your own country, or at least in your backyard. So just imagine there was the possibility of a war of any kind, then you would want to be able to produce the food you need for your own population and not having to import it. You want to be able to produce the arms that you need. You want to be able to have the fuel for your machinery that you need, and so on and so on. So what free trade does is it creates international interdependence, but it can also be not necessarily symmetrical, but it can be very asymmetric. So it can be a dependence in which you as a country depend on products that others make, and then this is bad for you. So even if free trade increases overall wealth, it will also increase dependency in a way that's bad from the state-centered perspective. And then as a free trader, you might counter this argument by saying, well, this is exactly why free trade is so great, because it creates international interdependency, and so it stops war from happening because now countries depend on one another and cannot afford to go to war. As a state-centered theorist or realist, you will counter this claim by pointing to the world wars and saying, well, we had free trade in the 19th century, and yet we had 2 world wars after this, so somehow it doesn't seem to work out that free trade guaranteed peace. Another claim state-centered theorists might take issue with is this idea of comparative advantage making production all over the place more effective, because all countries will have economies focused on the sectors where they are the most efficient. And this is not only a problem when it comes to dependency as a general problem, it's also more specifically a problem for those countries with the less developed industries, because they will almost necessarily then be forced to focus on the sectors that are less profitable and also strategically less important. So if you only produce wool or textiles, these are things the others might be able to go without for quite some time, and these are also sectors which do not win wars, and these are also sectors where the profit rates are not that high. So this kind of comparative advantage, it will always help the more advanced countries more than it will help the others. So it's not only that the absolute advantage will have difficulties for relative power relations, it will also stabilize certain relations. Finally, we have the idea that trade will help spread knowledge and ideas all over the world. And this is something where, as a realist or state-centric theorist, you might also have your problems with, because there you might think, well, it's kind of nice as everybody knows everything, but as a national government taking care of our relative power, we must be very careful what kind of technological knowledge we spread around the world. So do we want these less developed countries to learn all those technical abilities that make us more advanced and that give us an edge over them? This is one way to look at it. You can also, and this is then a much more conservative argument, say, well, we don't want the ideas from all over the world spread in our great culture, so this is more one of cultural nationalism, if you will. However, it can also be an argument that is sometimes mounted against free trade. So these are the arguments against free trade from this state-centric perspective. Secondly, we can also make a case against free trade from the perspective of class relations, and thereby I first mean class relations within the global north. There we can first take issue with this claim that for every job that is lost due to free trade, new, better jobs will be created. First, you can say, well, this sounds very nice. However, this will not help a 50-year-old textile worker who lost his job because production was relocated to Bangladesh, because they will not be able to become an IT consultant. They will most likely become unemployed for the last 5 or 10 years of their career, or if they don't become unemployed, they will have to do jobs that pay worse than the jobs they had before. So not industrial jobs, but maybe some some auxiliary jobs somewhere, maybe, I don't know, cleaning up somewhere. So this is a decline for them, and then it will not help them much that t-shirts will cost 30% less. And this is of course a variation of this Keynesian argument that in the long run we're all dead, meaning that neoclassic arguments often allude to developments that will take place in the long run. So if we have liberalization and free trade, in the long run it will be better for everyone, but we live right now and we have to think of the short run. And if in the short run there are people who have massive losses, then the idea that everyone will gain in the long run will be only a very, very weak solace for them. So this is a problem here. And in addition to that, we can also argue that it's not only about individual jobs that are lost, but it might also be that entire life worlds or ways of life can be destroyed. So if we have a certain town that is mainly built on one industry, then a whole culture and a whole way of living your life will be based on this industry and this income in this kind of town. And we had this famously, for example, with coal workers in England when coal mining was decommissioned there. There we had those mining towns and mining communities where the whole way of living, the whole way of looking at the world, the whole life world was sort of based on the fact that a good portion of the population of these towns were working in coal mining. And after coal mining disappeared, this whole way of life disappeared. And this is not about wanting to preserve every individual way of life everywhere. This is not what this is about, but it's about the fact that the people that live there then lose all the things that gave meaning to their life. They lose what gave them security, and they lose their way of living. And the prospect of some of them becoming taxi drivers, others becoming Uber drivers, and yet others becoming IT consultant with the mean income of all of them even increasing, might not help them from what over the loss that they have to face there. And of course then you can counter this counter argument by saying, okay, well, maybe then if we have free trade, we also need social programs to take care of the losers of these developments, and then maybe this can be weakened. However, it's not always the case that we have these kinds of social programs. Moreover, you can also take another issue from this class-focused approach, where you take issue with this claim that some may lose as employees, but everyone will win as consumers. And then you can argue, well, this is a very, very individualistic perspective where you only look at the individuals that will lose or gain economically, and then they lose some dollars from their pockets because their jobs may be lost, but then they would get some dollars back in their pockets because t-shirts will become cheaper. And then you can say, well, this is not a very good argument because this is something that does not see the meaning of collective struggle. So the relative position of a person does not only depend on these kind of economic calculation, it also depends on the outcome and the standing of bigger collective struggle, which here mainly is the abstract class struggle between labor and capital. And then you can say that much of what we have as successes in the European welfare states is something that comes from successful class struggles. And right now, because of free trade, the balance in these class struggles is shifting. So the successes in the class struggle mainly relied on workers being organized, which basically means workers being unionized. And now we have a situation where a lot of industry jobs are relocated from the richer countries to poorer countries. And industry jobs are typically jobs where unionization is rather easy and strong because they have a lot of people in the same workplace that can organize. And now if these jobs are relocated to poorer countries where we have fewer human rights, fewer rights of humans and of unions, and where all these situations are controlled, then labor cannot as effectively organize there than they could organize in the richer countries. Secondly, if the new jobs that are created in the richer countries are then jobs in the service sectors where individuals work on their own, they cannot organize efficiently either. So overall, the balance of power will shift towards the power of capital, which then might be a threat to the successes of the welfare state. So we cannot only look at the individual economic gains and losses of free trade, we also have to look on what it says for the power relations between classes. And here you might argue that what it means there is nothing good. Finally, we can also make a case against free trade from the North-South perspective, which mainly means from the perspective of the Global South. So free traders will claim that free trade is the best for everyone's total welfare. And then from a Global Southern perspective, you can argue, well, this may be true in theory, but it's very hard to explain this to farmers in poorer countries who lose their income due to land grabbing. And this partly alludes to what I said at the very beginning of the session, that free trade presupposes that there is such a thing as property. It also alludes to what I said before about ways of life. What you have to know here is that there are many countries in the world where the property of land is not really formally settled. So there is no big register where everything is recorded, which farmer owns which kind of land. There probably are these kind of registries. However, not every farm will be registered there. So it might very well be that you as a farmer have a piece of land that your family has used for generations and that you are just used to using, and you kind of think that's your land, that's your property. However, it might not be formally there in this registry, or it might be forgotten at some point, and then someone might come in and say, well, I want to grow wheat to export it to China right now, so I'm gonna buy all this land. And then they buy this land from the government very cheaply because they have friends in the government, and then they will just drive the farmers off what the farmers believe was their land, but it wasn't really formally at this point. So this is also something that is an effect of free trade, and this of course has tremendous human cost on those who are driven from their land for these reasons. And so this means once again that what sounds very plausible in theory, in economic levels, models, in numbers, that overall welfare will increase, gets a lot more complicated when you look at what it means at the ground level. Second, you can also take issue with this claim that nothing will help the least developed countries more than free trade in agriculture. Then you can say, well, yeah, you are right. If the European Union and the North American countries would open their markets to agricultural goods from the least developed countries, this would help the economies there. Absolutely, this is true. However, if we look at how free trade works, this is not how it works. So if you look at free trade deals, then you will always see that the richer countries do take advantage of the poorer countries, and this happens too often to say that it's only happening by accident. And real free trade is about all markets being open to everyone. What we have right now is sort of a defective free trade. This does not really live up to the ideals, so we cannot free trade. You can, as a critic, argue it's very nice of you that you have this high ideal of free trade where the European and North American markets are open, but if we think about free trade, we have to think about the actual power relations in which trade deals are made. And if you think of these actual power relations, then you will see that at the negotiating table, the richer countries have all kinds of means at their disposal to overpower the poorer governments. And it can be as simple as having all the economic expertise. So if the American government negotiates with some government from Africa or Latin America, we can be sure that the United States government has a whole staff of economic professors behind them who will in detail calculate what will have what effects for them. And the others probably don't have this kind of expertise and manpower, so they kind of have to rely on less information. And in these kind of negotiations, information is power, and in addition to this, power is also power. So the United States do not depend on free trade with Angola, but Angola does depend on free trade with the United States, for example. So it's very likely that all these negotiations will be tilted, and we can also see this in the negotiations in the GATT and in the WTO, where we oftentimes see developing nations making claims for liberalization in agriculture and not having success with them. And with this claim, you can say, well, this is not by chance, this is not by coincidence, this is a systematic problem of free trade. In effect, free trade is just an ideology of the rich countries, and it never really happens as it's supposed to happen. And so the rich are always the winners and the poor countries are the losers. However, in parentheses, we must say there have been some shifts and always some concessions made to the poorer countries when they're organized, however, never to full extent. Next, you can take issue once again with this claim that participating in trade is the best for developing countries. Then you can say, well, yes, it's better than isolation, but even better than free trade or isolation is strategic and selective trade. So we see those countries like in the 19th century, Germany, United States, Japan, or in the last century, some Asian states and later China, that those who participated strategically and not just opened up their markets, they fared best. So it's not free trade that we want. Finally, you can once again take issue with this idea that trade will spread knowledge and ideas. And here I want to highlight this one point about intellectual property rights, because this is something that the global northern countries have pushed in the past decades, that intellectual property is actually a part of free trade. So if you want to participate in the free trade of goods, you have to acknowledge intellectual property rights, which means you are not allowed to trade in pirated copies of Hollywood movies, and neither are you allowed to just manufacture medicine that you know works, but where the patents and the rights are the property of some northern corporations, and you're not allowed to do that. So if you look at this from a global southern perspective, then you might think, well, it's very nice that we can now learn, due to the knowledge spreading, how to create effective medicine against AIDS or against whatever disease, but then we're not allowed to produce this medicine, but have to buy it at very high prices from northern corporations. How do we benefit from knowledge spreading then? So this is one argument, and it holds as long as international and intellectual property rights are a part of free trade. You can also have this a little bit the other way around, because there are also particularly medical companies going all over the globe and looking what kind of traditional medicines and medicinal plants are out there that are used, and then learn this maybe from some native population and then claim this as their intellectual property, and then afterwards charge these others who use this for it maybe. So there are as a problem with the spread of knowledge if you think about it in a sense of intellectual property or patent rights. So bottom line, you might argue that in theory, in numbers, in models, in the long run, free trade is good for everyone. But if we look at it closer, if we look at it in short term, if we look at it not only in economic numbers, but also in what it means for the lives of human beings in the short run, then there are a lot of problems with free trade. And one of the things that I mention quite frequently is strategic trade policy. So this course of development that Germany, Japan, the United States, China, the so-called tiger states, and so on took quite successfully. And now we could argue, well, this is the gold middle. So we have some free trade, but not totally free trade. So we benefit from free trade. Thereby we allow these countries to develop. And I'm not saying it's not a good thing, but this is also exactly what I described before as this free riding in this free trade system. And it also, of course, is a strategy that only some countries can successfully deploy at a certain point of time, because not all developing countries in the world can build their economy by exporting to the same markets, because then it once again becomes competition. So don't believe that this is the golden solution to all problems. Finally, I want to give some remarks on free trade or trade in the context of the current pandemic and where this might go. I already showed you this diagram a couple of weeks ago, and maybe it means more to you right now, because here you once again see part of the success story of the World Trade Organization or the international free trade regime, because the total international merchandise trade is growing all the time with certain exceptions. So you see there is this one instance in the year 2001 when it did not grow, which had something to do with the 9/11 attacks, of course, but also with an economic crisis happening around this time. Then we have this significant dip in 2009, which was because of the Great Recession happening at the time. And then we see that growth never really adjusted back to the old level, but still there was growth in trade until last year. So this is also once again important to note that from 2018 to 2019, international trade did not grow, it stagnated already. So there was a number of signs for an economic crisis coming up, but now we will never know whether there would have been an economic crisis or even a decline in trade right now. However, we see this decline anyway now, but now it's driven by the pandemic mostly. And as you see with the green line and the red line, we do not yet know where this is going to go. So what are the effects of this pandemic on trade more generally? I already mentioned this sharp decline in trade, and if you look at the reasons for it, they are basically on all sides. So you have problems in demand, because right now many individual households think twice before they invest, let's say, in a new car or even in smaller things. Some of them do so because they became more careful because they're not sure what the income will be next year. Others do so because they already lost their jobs. So there is a decline on demand when it comes to consumer goods. There's also some decline in demand when it comes to companies investing, because they're also very wary of what the next years might bring. So we have a decline in demand, and so if fewer people want stuff, then less stuff will be shipped around the world. We also have supply problems in some parts. So production has declined almost in all countries. It started, of course, in China, in the Hubei province, then also in other places in Asia. Then it moved to Europe, first to Italy, and then basically all over the world we have stops or declines in production. And if less stuff is produced, of course, also less stuff is shipped around the world. And then we finally also have problems in transportation itself. So, for example, a good part of the air cargo that's transported is not transported in cargo planes, but rather as additional payload in passenger planes. And since there are no passenger planes at the moment, we have a problem with air cargo transport and also with land-based transport. And shipping also became somewhat difficult in the last couple of months. Another immediate effect that we are seeing when it comes to free trade is that we now see a growing number of export restrictions. So I already said that trade restrictions these days typically are import restrictions. So governments don't want certain imports into their country because they want to shield their domestic industries. Now, however, we see these kind of export restrictions where certain protective gear or maybe ventilators and other medical equipment is banned from leaving the country. So the countries want to keep all the stuff they have because they now have an urgent need for it, and they don't believe they can get what they want on international markets, so they just want to keep what they have, and they don't want others to buy the stuff that's already in their country, which is probably a very understandable reaction. However, it comes with problem and with cost, of course. So, for example, at the time when the German government imposed these export restrictions on masks, was a time when in Germany there were kind of enough masks for the hospitals at least, while this was not the case in Italy. So the problems in Italy even increased due to the Germans and others having these kinds of export restrictions. So in generally the supply on the markets of course declines when there are export restrictions, and if the supply declines then the prices will increase even faster. So this comes with problems, but for the individual country it's understandable. However, I don't think that this will have much of a long-term effect on trade relations, because this relates very much to an urgency that we had and still have, but this will not last forever. If we look at the long-term effects, we see that there is some talk about relocating the production of strategic medical supplies back home, or at least back to your region. So in general, the idea of the last couple of years or decades was you produce everything in the places where you can produce it the cheapest, because then you will save money and everybody wins, because that's free trade. Right now, more governments think that this, or realize that this also makes them vulnerable. If international trade collapses and we have supply problems and we have delivery problems, then we don't want our basic medical supplies being delivered to us from all over the world. And if the cost differential isn't that high, so if it doesn't cost that much more to produce it in Germany than in China, there might be a consideration of relocating some of the production to Germany. However, it's then not so easy to see how this will work within the international free trade regime, because it will only probably work with some kind of subsidies, and then you have to argue that this is an issue of national security. So this will be a problem, and also it of course will still cost more money. And then you can also argue, well, if we start producing this at home? Aren't there all other kinds of goods that could be very important in a different kind of crisis? And then you can argue that this is a slippery slope, and an alternative to relocating production to your country is of course just storing strategic supplies. So in the 70s, all industrialized countries began to create strategic supplies of crude oil. So maybe they will now increase their strategic supplies and certain medical supplies in order to avoid this from happening once again. Another possible long-term effect is that some companies might to re-evaluate the economic risk associated with global production chains. Next week we're going to discuss global productions, and then we will see that right now only very few products are really produced in one country. Most of them are produced in a lot of countries all over the time, and this of course makes the whole process more vulnerable. So if one of these factories does not work for a certain time, then the whole chain might stop at some point. And so it might very well be that, for example, German car manufacturers will think twice before resuming to the status quo ante and just doing again what they did before. Finally, and again this is very speculative, we can guess that we already saw a halt in global trade. We already saw an increase in state-centered and nationalist economic policies in Great Britain, in the United States, and that this was already happening, and that this dynamic might be accelerated due to the pandemic. However, this is not certain at all. So that's it for today. I tried to make as good as a case for free trade as I could. I also tried to make as good as cases against free trade as I could. Don't quote me on any of this, please. But I hope it worked out for you. See you.